and regional planning. We are also, I think, extremely fortunate to have the exhibition upstairs that I think hopefully most of you have seen, which is part of the collaboration between Anu and Dilip Dakuna, collaborator, assisting her in the work. What is really wonderful about the exhibition is that it's such an incredible labor of love that has obviously taken enormous effort, energy, and commitment to make it possible. I think that there is in the school quite a lot of interest in the topic of landscape. And I think it's also good to see someone who's really made such a strong commitment to documenting in some way, looking very carefully at a particular landscape of the Mississippi in terms of how the effect of the floods over a very, very long period of time actually transforms in a way the archaeological landscape of the city itself. Also to really think very carefully about alternative modes of presentation or representation of this, ranging from ink drawings to silk screen printing, photography, all the different material that in some way touch on the various modes of perception of the landscape itself, which leads to, I think, quite interesting and significant discoveries in a way about this particular terrain. I'd like you to join me in welcoming Anu Mathur, please.
Thank you, Mohsen. It's really wonderful to be in London and at the AA. I would like to start directly with the slides, so if I could get the lights dimmed. And I think I can figure this out. Landscapes, like what you see here in front of you, undergo extreme transformations. And they reveal something significant, perhaps which is true of all landscapes. They comprise of shifting matters. I refer, for example, to river deltas which pass through cycles of flood and drought, to the post-industrial city, which experiences frequent waves of construction and destruction, and temperate forests which endure seasons of fire and water. Now, sites in these landscape elude definitions that landscape architects often need in their analysis and interventions. This elusiveness is not only witnessed in material terms, when floodwaters and dust storms show little respect for site boundaries. Smoke, moisture, and contaminants move freely across property lines. And urban development and waste cross planned limits. It is also expressed in ideological terms, when these landscapes define models that seek to contain them. Thus, strategies deployed for inhabiting deltas are retreating from full-scale control of the river to admit unsettling parts of these landscapes. Plans for cities are moving from a preoccupation with the good city form to an accommodation for the event city. And forest management models have progressed from the determinism and certainty of machines and superorganisms to the chance and complexities of ecosystems. Here it is not merely the nature of interventions which shifts, it is also the identities of landscapes. They are strained by the particularities of place. On the one hand, recognizing shifting matters, both material and cultural, may lead to the further refinement and definitions of models of sites in these troublesome landscapes, accommodating the particularities of the shifting condition. On the other hand, this recognition may lead to a different perception of landscapes, landscape in which shift is intrinsic. Landscape cannot be held down to predictions and products any more than the Mississippi can be held to its course, a city to a plan, or smoke and moisture to a source. As such, landscape that reveals on its surface, in its matter, its soil, 1 billion years of time is as much a project for the imagination as for science. The challenge for design is then to engage rather than define, cultivate rather than contain. By engagement and definition, I mean a suspension of destination just enough to include walking there, of experience just enough to permit mystery, a firm ground just enough to find room for shifting matters. In a forest landscape, the search for a path initiates a process of drawing and making that begins with engagement rather than definition of a site. This forest that you see in these slides is part of a region called the Pine Barrens in New Jersey, which is 2 hours from Philadelphia, and it is the site of an introductory design studio in landscape architecture. Oak forests, hardwood swamps, pitch pine lowlands, cedar bogs, marshes to open waterways. The landscape of the Pine Barrens can be distinguished by the presence and absence of water. Its sandy soils have facilitated the formation of one of the largest aquifers. Fire, managed and wild, however, remains a crucial agent in the construction and destruction of this landscape. Settled and intensely used for a time in the 19th century for its natural resources that facilitated the making of iron, the Pine Barrens continues to exist on a fragile compact between natural processes and that of human occupation. But to consider the forest as a repository and a generator of matter in which shift is intrinsic presents a particular direction for design exploration. While geological, hydrological, and historical depths have been long sought by ecologists, engineers, and archaeologists, the depth one needs to pursue is one that nurtures the imagination. By allowing the designer, surveyor, to reside in the tension between orientation and distraction, knowledge and expression, measurement and the experience of walking. Drawing and construction can pursue this depth of matter as a source of creativity in making landscape, the first mark towards inhabiting the forest. Staining is a process that reveals encounters between 2 or more materials, most commonly in the presence of moisture. To engage the process of staining as a means to construct a map which records conditions of wetness, dryness of a site, on a surveyed drawing demands patience and precision. Stains are invented and categorized by a key of words to present qualities, perceptions, and gradients in the presence and absence of moisture. In the process of constructing such a map, the materials being used, the watercolor paper, the staining substances expose properties that can be directed but not entirely controlled. Staining thus becomes analogous to making landscape, where knowledge and action and the inherent freedom of materials exist in a constructive tension. To study the presence of moisture in a site is not to exclude other conditions. It is rather a starting point of inquiry. The enclosure and disclosure of territories, the addition and subtraction of topographies become ways of entering the forest. Drawing, constructions, and building then become a way of uncovering particular materials and processes of a site. Now, this may be achieved not only through a study of material attributes of a site, but also through an investigation of the way a landscape is traversed. In studying movement and space in Kurosawa's film, it becomes apparent that an understanding of space is not simply achieved by studying the setting in which things are arranged, but that the construction of space is also the space of the action. In his essay, Walking, Henry David Thoreau observes that walking has nothing in it akin to taking exercise, as the sick take medicine at stated hours. But it is itself the enterprise and adventure of the day. Moreover, you must walk like a camel, which is said to be the only beast that ruminates while walking. Then walking in this spirit becomes a means of exploring a site, and drawing becomes a means of walking a landscape. And all these drawings that I'm showing are from first-year students of landscape architecture. Measuring then involves the movement of the body as much as the traveling of our eyes that might rest, wander, and pause, and extend beyond the enclosure it inscribes. Drawing then allows us not only to represent things or images seen, but to construct a forest through movement and measure on the two dimensions of a drawing surface. By drawing the forest through movement along chosen trajectories, students construct a path. Their path brings into presence a particular point of view, a prospect about the formation or viewing of this landscape. It becomes a vehicle through which they unfold this landscape, a journey that, while having beginnings and ends, sets into motion many readings, and also the continued transformation of the Pine Barrens. This was a proposal for a garden of control burn, which allowed for a systemic transformation of a territory in the Pine Barrens. And the clearing and separating of existing slag pile, which is remnant of iron making, allowed for a student to really develop what she called a fire-safe path in the forest. And the drawing on the left shows her the line of actually running off if the fire gets too much. From a path in the Pine Barrens, I moved to an infrastructure in the steel town of Bethlehem in Pennsylvania. While infrastructure is typically associated with the transportation, storage, production, and distribution of commodities, it could also be seen as a landscape in which shift is intrinsic. Walking along as it would appear here, if not literally, at least through drawing, processes of excavation, purification, isolation, transformation, and creation of matter, processes that give life to this landscape, gave a potential to opening an inquiry that did not presuppose a distinction between human and nature, between engaged and disengaged grounds of the city. This propelled an investigation into the city of Bethlehem in Lehigh Valley, which is about 2 hours from Philadelphia also, a town which is largely created by iron and steel, through the matter of its steel plant. In the process of closing its operation, the plant today presents a landscape where construction and destruction collapse into a simultaneous reality, a landscape made by the processes of transformation, excavation, and production of material. Traversing infrastructure here uncovers a vast topography of slag, 200 acres in area and about 100 feet deep at the edge of the steel plant, invisible to its residents. Formation and destruction are seen in the continuum of reconstruction. This leads to strategic design proposals for sites and materials in transition. So the cutting away of slag is directed strategically to allow for public engagement. It initiates a proposal for the city by inhabiting the shifting edge of the slag pile. A bike trail, a bat farm, city recycling center come together with the process of removing slag, which is reused in the making of highways, and as a result transforming this edge of the city programmatically and physically, I guess as long as the slag lasts. Infrastructure then allows us to see material in a particular way. Here the city is continually being transformed, and it tends to escape its own representations, shaped and reshaped by dynamic processes that displace, gather, and dissipate material. These two images, at least the one on the left, is from southern Philadelphia, which is the site of a studio I'm currently part of at Penn. Here, infrastructure and material have opened an inquiry into what we call its backyard, the working landscape of Philadelphia. I'll move a little bit from teaching to practice. I would like to share with you a few recent explorations about some dramatic sites which I have done with Dilip, my husband and partner. I'll begin with a project for Governor's Island in New York Harbor. Occupied by the Coast Guard, Governor's Island, which looks so strategic in these aerial photographs and as well as maps of this area, is largely invisible to the public because of restricted access. Until that is recent design competitions for its future post-military use drew attention to its presence. Must it remain an enclave or become a public matter, was the question raised. The entire island is about 175 acres, which is accessed only by ferries, and it has two parts. The north side has, I guess I did have a pointer. Yeah. Oops. The north side, which is this circular territory, which is about 72 acres of bedrock, with a fort, a castle, and barracks, and a number of stately residences. It is a National Historic Monument. The southern part, on the other hand, is about 103 acres of landfill, which was made by the excavations of the New York subways, excavations from buildings, as well as what is called the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, which runs underneath from Manhattan to Brooklyn, and it only has a vent which emerges on Governor's Island here. On this part, there are a number of nondescript buildings from the 1970s, and these two parts of the island are separated by what is a long barrack building, which seems to divide the historic as well as this relatively new part of the island. And one can get a sense how, if one is really at any one of these points, it doesn't appear. This is still from the air. That's Governor's Island, Manhattan, Brooklyn. And the site, physically as well as in terms of what it gathers, extends into the region. And this region, like Governor's Island, has divergent horizons, which I am calling entities or tensions which can be negotiated but never quite resolved in these areas. So we have Manhattan in the north, where skyscrapers and subways are negotiated by streets. I think the next map would be more useful. That's Governor's Island, and that's Manhattan. There's Brooklyn in the west, where freeways and communities negotiate each other. On this end is New Jersey, where networks and this whole movement and transit are trying to work with habitation. And right at this corner, you have the Statue of Liberty, which is trying to, I guess, for the whole country, negotiate rights and duties. Returning to Governor's Island, this scene helped to conceptualize a tension between firm ground and shifting ground, and points to the need for a negotiating ground, which, like street networks and community, can be rich in possibilities. We call this infrastructure. The map on the right is from the turn of the century, which you can see is before the southern end was added to it. To complement this horizontal extension of site, we were drawn to its depth, an island extended vertically through its material strata. It brought a realization that what moves around a New York region is soil, that the movement of soil is its dynamic entity. This map on the right plots many of these movements of excavations, garbage, landfill, as well as immigrants. The proposal was titled Soil That New York Rejected and Recollects. It negotiates horizons such as bedrock and landfill, sky and earth, history and possibility, firm ground and shifting ground, in the search for a facilitating ground. We intervened in 3 places in this particular island, which was distinct in its old materiality. On these models, this was the historical part, and we called the interventions over here firm ground. The facilitating ground is territories which negotiate this as well as the edge. And shifting ground is this area which is not represented in the model, which was really a site given over to the city of New York for transformations. So firm ground is a place of bedrock, sky, and history. It is the realm of the spectator. 2 interventions here return the island embedded in its history to the city, while keeping it from being an attraction trapped in its past. The first is the opening up and extending of this edge, which is right now blocked by a ferry terminal as well as a number of buildings, and allowing this fort which sits over here to really acknowledge the Manhattan skyline, and in some ways to construct a stage to the bay. The second is the transformation of the inside of that fort, which is a courtyard used for housing primarily, into a stage of performance for New York. And it's something which relates to the sky, even though one is very aware of the city beyond. The shifting ground is a place of landfill, earth, and possibility. It is the realm of the actor. Constructions built on it, however permanent, whether for shelter, storage, parks, exhibitions, sport, industry, or housing, will always be provisional. It provides the flux that complements the firmness and fixity of bedrock. And facilitating ground is a place of infrastructure, of landscapes that allow the coexistence of divergences, spectator and actor. We propose 3 interventions over here, and the 3 are these territories. One is the building, which did initially divide the 2 islands, has in some ways been stitched together by rows of trees, which also provide the place for people arriving, and ferry docks on this end, which have been shifted to the calmer waters of a buttermilk channel here. Further south, there are also the construction docks, which aid the processes of the shifting ground. Traversing the western edge of the island, a harbor promenade acknowledges the dramatic presence of the Manhattan skyline, the Statue of Liberty, and the New York Bay, framed by measures of wind and water. Between this promenade and the shifting ground to its east is a walk called Way Stations. It connects the stage on the north with a repository on the south of the island. This way registers the geology, archaeology, and history of this site. It is marked at intervals by stations, structures for the cultivation, display, and exchange of material, organic and inorganic, that support the transformation of the shifting ground. And this was the Way Station, which you see in this section. And the model and the drawing is really a schematic study of how this would be ordered. The repository sounds the depth of the earth and presents the history of transformations of soil of this land, its rejection and collection. And here again on the right, firm ground, shifting ground, and facilitating ground. Design's potential to facilitate divergence suggests an agenda for Governor's Island. It recognizes diversity as a necessary complement in the construction of New York's edifices, material and cultural. The island's shifting ground can serve not only to complement the firm ground of the original island, it can also provide the people of New York with a nomadic site that keeps the debate initiated by the withdrawal of the US Coast Guard open to imaginative constructions. We call these potential plots landscapes of reconstruction. Infrastructure here then facilitates future projects on the shifting ground of Governor's Island. It sows the seed of a dialectic that allows new life to emerge from the soil that New York rejected. This project was also part of an exhibition which is traveling in the United States, and some of these drawings I've shown you come from that. Far from New York Harbor, in the city of Bangladesh, issues of matter and material in flux initiated for me a process of drawing and making to engage a dynamic landscape. Bangladesh sits precariously in the delta of 3 major river systems, the Ganga, the Brahmaputra, and the Meghna. It is prone to cycles of flood and drought. The latter, when resisted, results in extreme devastation. To me, it is a landscape where the only permanence for large portions of its land is its impermanence. Physical processes such as erosion, deposition, and inundation continually make and change this landscape. The site of a proposal is the north edge of the assembly complex designed by Lou Kahn. The assembly complex is here, and this was really the largest site which I'm looking at. It mediates between the high ground of the city and the low ground of the floodplain. This land once supported extensive farming and scattered dwelling, while also being a back swamp for the Buriganga River. Over the decades, it has been subjected to ad hoc developments, filling, and occupation by squatters who maintain a precarious existence in the floodplain. This is a view of the Capitol complex as well as looking from its roof towards the back swamp territory. Lucan's complex was really originally built outside the city as an enclave, but the city has really come around it. So in many ways, it is also under pressure to acknowledge its new position in the landscape. The project is concerned in a physical, socio-economic, and metaphorical sense with the edge between built claimed ground and the shifting flux ground of the floodplain, or the remaking of ground in a shifting landscape. I present a few analogous sites to explore this landscape. Khan's complex under construction is one site. These montages connect Khan's sense of order and the order of the delta, the ritual of the people, as well as the idea of threshold and incompletion. In this dynamic delta, erosion and deposition go on continuously with ebb and flow. The flat topography spreads floodwaters evenly, and slight changes in elevation create distinction between inundated and habitable ground. In order to dwell on these dynamics, I construct a device to be situated between high ground and the low shifting ground that engages in the remaking of ground. This structure, anchored deep in the soil, tenaciously withstands the seasonal floods. Its sinewy arm, set in motion by incoming and receding waters and balanced by counterweights, scrapes the silt of the floodplain, slowly yet insistently allowing it to be carried and deposited behind reed barriers to make new ground. The project then, between high stable ground and the low shifting ground, is an attempt to reconfigure and reclaim this land as a place to inhabit, physically and programmatically in the shifting context of Dhaka. And the image on the left is really an aerial photograph from the 1960s, and most of this agricultural land has been taken over today. And the proposal was really to reclaim it, not so much by cordoning it off, but by making a project a public park or a place to come, but essentially generated by the starting of an agricultural institute, which would be a place for education, experimental farming, and exchange for the people of Dhaka. Responding to conditions of flood and drought that require the drainage as well as retention of water, the project is generated by its water structures. Low-lying reservoirs scattered in the floodplain, and raised reservoirs terminating the canals of high ground. The canals also define a series of linear gardens and fields inundated during flood. This drawing presents the project, I suppose, in the dry season when the water is low. And the areas here are gardens while they become agricultural fields as they go forward. And they would be manned by the people, the immigrants who come into town. A section which just gives the scale and immensity of this landscape. And these paintings further explore the scale and setting of the water gardens. And I'm sorry, one of them is flipped around. The model speculates on the architecture of the reservoirs which terminate these canals, and also become places for introspection and places to be, which could help contain as well as allow one to view this immense landscape. And what got called the maker of ground is now transferred to the canals, scraping their floor as the flood moves in, keeping them free of siltation. As the only verticals in this vast horizontal landscape, they become the gateway and the guardians of the city. And this drawing and study model initiates a process of construction between fingers of firm and shifting ground as rivers flood. Now, closer to home for me in Philadelphia is an island called Venice Island, which is a mile long. It's the whole island which goes along the Schuylkill Expressway as well as the Schuylkill River. And this site was important because it's also a landscape which has witnessed cycles of industrialization and abandonment. Venice Island itself is open to the rhythm of the surrounding railways and expressways at the edge of the city. The island and the canal along it, where most of Manyoung's mills were sited, lie largely abandoned and polluted. I present this site through a few recordings. A recording in this context would be any device that could measure or reveal aspects of the site's temporal and material nature. The Rain Man, that 7 years later got spliced into the New York horizon, recalls the memory of the site, its temporal and dynamic qualities, the light, the colors, the wind, and the wetness. This artifact presents a series of mapping devices located on a spillway of the canal wall that is 30 feet in elevation from the river below. The traversing of water through this device registers the physical and chemical properties of water, of corrosion, erosion, deposition, and calcification. The theme of the project is the purification of water. The site itself becomes a sieve, a filter, a gauge to map and change the quality of water, and be changed by it as it traverses the land from the canal to the river, cleansing, eroding, and depositing. Or perhaps a ritual path, remembering, forgetting, and creating anew. It is structured by devices to purify water, dams, infiltration canals, wetlands, and mapping stations. The canals which you see here are cut at the same place where geologically opening did occur, while underneath the rest of the island is bedrock called Wissahickon Schist. A section which goes through this very, very flat terrain. Some initial studies to explore the setting and the scale of this landscape. And the project is revealed to a visitor through the chronology of the path. As the person moves across the terrain, episodes unfold. And rambling conversations begin as the landscape discloses and reveals secrets about itself. We need the next tray. We will now return to what one can consider the American heartland, to infrastructure and to two tragedies which have taken place there in the past 70 years. The first is the bombing of the Mora Federal Building in Oklahoma City on April 19, 1995, which killed 168 people. The second, 60-odd years ago, is the Dust Bowl, when extensive sod busting, absentee farming in a drought-prone prairie landscape made bright, warm days in the southern plains turn to dark, chilly ones. Huge, ominous waves of dust, rootless soil, hundreds of feet high, 100 miles wide, moving at 50 miles per hour, choked everything in their path. The project is for a memorial on the site of the 1995 tragedy. Here, Dilip and I saw it as an opportunity, not merely to memorialize the victims of the bombing, but to re-engage the grounds of the city. 60 years after the Dust Bowl, detached urban infrastructure has made obsolete, fragmented, and impermeable landscapes possible. It was fertilizer made to nurture the life of soil that was used to destroy life indiscriminately in Oklahoma City. Urban dust exploded by fertilizer is the ultimate tragedy of disengaged soil. The 3-acre memorial site includes the footprint of the building, which was the Mora building, which at this point has not been demolished, but in the photograph on the right has already been leveled. The 5th Street on which the Ryder truck in which the ammunition was parked, and a parking lot on the other side, which was later leveled because of much damage, and the presence of a slippery elm tree, which survived the bomb blast and was commemorated by the community. Interestingly, the slippery elm was also the tree which was planted after the Dust Bowl to actually bind the soil of that region again. The memorial was seen as a way of actually starting to cultivate this ground, this really desolate city which is full of parking lots and asphalt. The elements of the project are a grass plain with the survivor elm tree, which is the area here, and the elm tree here. A wheat field, which is on where the footprint of the Mora building was, and a sunken street garden, which is really the memorial itself for people to actually come and walk. And there is also a terrace which was part of the project, and a remnant, the only remnant of the existing building, which has been included as part of this project. The wheat field was seen as a place for nurturing. Here on the sacred ground of the Mora building, people of Oklahoma City will seed, tend, and harvest wheat. The grass plain is a place for gathering. It was traversed by cross timbers, which are rows of oak tree, which come from a feature of this region, and these are these rows. A platform under the survivor tree provides a benchmark. The street garden and excavated thoroughfare retains the city fabric. It is a place for renewal. This view overlooks the site from where the terrace garden would be. The street garden contains a soil bed to allow visitors to plant memorabilia, feel soil, and take a handful of dirt. A well marks the bomb site. A soil room around the well is held by a glass wall inscribed with the names of the victims, seen against the earth of the wheat field. The south wall of the sunken garden is faced with an exhibit, From Plains Dust to Urban Dust. The north wall is lined with soil cars. These are sites for contemporary interpretations of the Oklahoma tragedy by artists and cultivators from around the world. And the section cuts across the site with the grass plain and the benchmark. And strangely enough, we were asked in the program to provide a place not only for the victims, but also for the survivors. And who is a survivor is really up in debate. And so this was a place to put their names in: the sunken garden, the wheel feet, and the remnant wall. And the question, of course, that this project was raised for us was, does a memorial of the site of a tragedy merely memorialize victims, or can it also renew the ground of the city that was the context of the tragedy? From the dust of the prairies, I will finally move to the disengaged mud of the Mississippi. Reports provided by the Army Corps of Engineers state that the Mississippi carries in suspension over 4.5 million tons of mud each year, which it deposits in the Gulf of Mexico. This is equivalent to 25,000 railroad cars topped with mud moving across America, dumping their load into the Gulf of Mexico daily. Let me take you 500 miles upriver to the region where the Mississippi begins its delta processes. Outside the city of Jackson, Mississippi, lies abandoned the world's most ambitious working model, the Mississippi Basin model. 200 acres were molded into a giant relief map where 1 foot on the model equals 100 feet of the Mississippi landscape. And in the vertical direction, 2,000 feet, 100 feet was the vertical and 2,000 in the horizontal. I think in human scale, it was really a step was equivalent to a mile. Constructed in 1993 and 1946 by a 3,000 strong camp of POWs from Germany, This model reveals a Mississippi not only of the engineers, but of the public imagination. The purpose of this model was to monitor the flow of water in the river system, especially in times of flood, and to be a tool for testing and sanctioning future constructions. Soil here, translated into coefficient of friction, is accounted for in the texture of this vast concrete topography. And flowing water, monitored by pumps, valves, and pipes, represent the mighty Mississippi. The fascinating abstraction and realism of this model makes visible the segregation of material and form, time and place that pervades the engineer's reading of the Mississippi. Today, the model stands abandoned, but this does not mean that it is rejected. It has merely moved from this weathering ground to the unfettered coordinates of cyberspace. The dematerialization of the Mississippi had begun well before the advent of computers. The model reveals a river constantly watched, monitored, and maintained in place, a public enemy and an inert system that can be engineered. This construction of the Mississippi has occurred as much on dry drawing boards and congressional hearings as it has upon the wet grounds of the river. Maps, surveys, datum sheets, commercial and political profits, scientific facts, and media reporting, especially after the event of destructive floods, have constructed the Mississippi as we know it today. Levees, revetments, cutoffs, dredge channels remain the physical evidence of a battle that began in 1879 with the mandate to hold in place a shifting landscape. And this was really the year where the Mississippi River Commission, which was the body which looked after this landscape, was set up. Levees confine the Mississippi along the whole length of the lower half from the point where it enters the alluvial plains and eventually its delta. Levees separate water from the adjacent land, which is very often at a higher level. The water is at a higher level to the land. These levees have, from the early 1700s, risen and are almost about 40 feet today. Revetments pave the river's bed. They are concrete mats stitched together with heavy metal wire. They crumble with the force of the river, only to be replaced again. Dredges suck out the bottom of the river that carries huge amounts of silt, sediment, and living matter, ever willing to set in midstream. The effort is to clean and manicure a river road and continental drain. But the Mississippi floods. It floods despite the heroic efforts to control its course. The floods recur with billions of dollars in measurable destruction and immeasurable distress, and shake the stability of these constructions. They crumble revetments and break levees, but they also challenge perceptions that have, for the past 2 centuries, sought to limit the Mississippi. One may continue to take the route of the engineers and develop more sophisticated and stable constructions to keep the Mississippi in place. Or one may question the perception of it as river. Are engineers constructing a landscape through their interventions, the underlying representations taken for granted by a public and the public imagination? The purpose of this digression to Jackson, with which we began, was to pose the question about what is seen. Is the Mississippi a river, a defined entity within a larger material and cultural landscape that exerts an authority over it? Or is it an identity unbound, a landscape that exercises its own authority, a landscape that Mark Twain called the body of the nation? E.F. Schumacher, author of Small is Beautiful, after getting lost in Leningrad with a map in hand, wrote in his book, A Guide for the Perplexed, "The maps of real knowledge designed for real life did not show anything except things that allegedly could be proved to exist. The first principle of the map may seem to be, if in doubt, leave it out, or put it in a museum. It occurred to me, however, that the question of what constitutes proof was a very subtle and a difficult one. Would it not be wiser to turn the principle into its opposite and say, if in doubt, show it prominently? After all, matters that are beyond doubt are, in a sense, dead. They do not constitute a challenge to the living. And this is close quotes of what Schumacher wrote. Are we pushing the wrong maps, the wrong images? In an age of information, are we still in terra incognita, unknown land? What new maps do we need to reveal what we do not know and therefore must negotiate? This was our purpose in traveling the landscape. It was not to tame the Mississippi yet again, but to recognize its living, shifting, even diverging nature. But more importantly, it was to construct a civic exhibition, a way to share this recognition with people and with the knowledge that it has the potential of constructing, not merely informing a people. Therefore, starting at the model at Jackson, which we call Site 0, and which on this map is this territory over here, we traveled not a river, but a landscape. The travel was as much through documents, maps, surveys, photographs, engineers' datum sheets, newspaper reports, as it was across a varied material terrain. In the course of negotiating this vast and complex landscape, we were drawn to sites with rich and layered phenomena, or sites that had been the foci of repeated flood surveys as well as constructions and conflicts. These sites structure the investigation and the exhibition that is upstairs. In the process of surfacing these tensions, we call these landscapes in which shift in a way was intrinsic: meanders, banks, flows, and beds. And the 4 sites presented upstairs, that's site 1 is meanders, which is a large territory called the delta, flows, banks, and beds. Meanders site the Greenville Bends, which is approximately 100 miles above Jackson. They were the site of one of the cutoffs between 1930s and 1940s to shorten the river by 150 miles. The Mississippi has been reported to have regained 1/3 of that length. Meanders, more importantly, bring into presence the falls delta of the Mississippi and the Yazoo. 10 miles above the Greenville Bends, the water of the Mississippi had burst through a levee on April 21, 1927. It inundated the lower half of the falls delta, which is shaped as an elm leaf. This is not the real delta of the Mississippi, but the confluence of the Mississippi and the Yazoo River. The flood waters stretched from Greenville to the door of Greenwood, extending down to Vicksburg in the south, the point where the leaf drains through a system of levees into the Big Muddy, as the Mississippi is fondly called, as it eventually did in 1927. Coinciding with the first use of aviation for reconnaissance and rescue, the vast inundated horizons of the delta, seen from aeroplanes, captured the public imagination. It paved the way for greater federal funds for keeping the Mississippi in a straight and narrow path. In the delta, the engineered curves of the river reside uneasily with the blues meanders of a landscape. Brought so dramatically and devastatingly into presence in 1927, the delta embodies a unique rhythm of the Mississippi as landscape. It is perhaps best revealed by delta blues. One commentator describes the blues as more than music, a state of mind and a place. Its twists, turns, and quavers, swooping dips and sudden climbs, the attack and release of notes resist Western musical notation. Rooted in the hollows of cotton field, railroad gangs, levee camps, the blues is the music of a landscape cleared and drained by slaves and bonded labor in the 18th century. Once the water was pushed back and behind the levees, the delta was available for cotton fields and other demands of the plantation culture. In delta, the Charlie Patton's High Water Everywhere, and Charlie Patton was one of the most famous blues musicians who came out of there, has a special significance. He's not merely singing about the 1927 flood. He's giving voice to a landscape, bonded but not bound. A landscape, when photographed from space, is covered from levee to bluff with the traces of a meandering Mississippi, leaving little doubt to the legacy or to the agency of its making. It is still one of the poorest parts of America, with probably the richest agricultural soil in the world. Today, the delta held behind 40 feet of levee at regulated grades. The bonded and the boundless seem polarized. On one side of the levees are marked by the clicking of pivot irrigators, the drone of the Cessna planes on pesticide flybys, and the swishing of aerators in catfish farms. Catfish is the new money crop, or the fast-growing money crop as they call it, and is ironically inundating the delta, although not from river water, but from scarce groundwater. The eye is carried to the horizon by long lines of earth furrows. This is probably clearly seen upstairs than on these slides. Drainage channels, cotton, rice, soybeans, the rhythmic span of the pivot irrigators, the gleaming surface of catfish ponds. It is a seemingly predictable world adjacent to and hidden behind from the river, which constructed the tens of feet of alluvial topsoil. And this is a transect from Greenville, where the cutoffs happen, to Greenwood, which is the edge of a bluff. And in the 1927 flood, this is where everyone who had to escape the flood had to run to. But this landscape, which is seemingly protected, is in stark contrast to the wilderness on the other side of the levee, hidden from resident and visitor. Here, the Mississippi, this is still part of the delta landscape, which is very open and calm. And on the other side, the Mississippi plays havoc with boundary lines. Stack Island is a case in point. In 1927, the US Supreme Court decided that a sand bank which had extended the Louisiana side of the channel adjacent to the city of Providence over the last couple of decades is in fact Stack Island that belonged to the state of Mississippi. The judge was convinced by a series of Army Corps maps and surveys from the early 1800s to date. Overlaid, these maps made a case for an island that keeps rolling along, widening, diminishing, elongating, sliding, and attaching itself to the landmass of Louisiana, and dragging with it the indefinite boundary between the contesting states to a new, somewhat absurd location which is grounded. A report in the New York Times summarizes the dilemma as follows. Were those 2,000 muddy acres, they were underwater part of the year, the same muddy acres that were in the 19th century? Existential geology, anyone? Engineers' curves have evidently not prevented the Mississippi from moving boundaries, material and judicial. The second site, which we've called Site 2, flows site the apex of the Cajun country, 150 miles below Jackson, where the Mississippi connects with the Atchafalaya and Red River. This intersection has been called the most direct confrontation between the Mississippi and the US government. Here, a battle between the discharge of managed waters and the flow of living matter has waged since 1950. And this is the construction of a major control structure which really manages the whole triangle and the flow of water in this territory. The management of discharge has frozen space and arrested time, according to General Thomas Sand of the Army Corps. Today, the gates of this control structure that you see here divide waters on the basis of a hypothetical flood, discharging 30% into the Atchafalaya and 70% into the Mississippi. But flows, still so visible in the Atchafalaya, construct a labyrinth of bayous and swamps, a living, breathing terrain, unmappable and ever-changing. Bayous negotiate and keep alive 700,000 acres of swampland and Cajun culture, flowing sometimes one way and sometimes another, seeking a shifting level. As arbitrators of flows, the Army Corps are finding it an impossible task to level discourse on contesting demands for the enhancement or reduction of water. And so this is one of the most contested terrains in the country where the battle between the management of discharge and the flow of bayous wages on. Banks cite the top of levees that since the 1800s have slowly but surely risen. 50 miles below the control structure which we just saw begins a corridor from Baton Rouge to New Orleans that has been defined and made by banks. While floods gather and enrich soil to cultivate banks, crevasses break levees to wash away soil and destroy property. These banks continue to be defined by higher levees and stronger revetments to keep the further of waters in. Bordered by plantations and stately homes, this corridor, which is also known as the American Ruhr, has given way to the round-the-clock rhythms of a booming petrochemical and transportation industry. And the historical plantations and the petrochemical occupy the same ordering system of arpents, which is a system of measurement which was taken from the river frontage alone. These banks also gather a landscape of bridges and belts, landings, remnant alleys, poverty, and progress. I'm going through this fairly fast because I guess the best way to see these drawings is really upstairs. Traveling on the river, which was very difficult to get onto because most of the Mississippi is divided into the channel and the rest of the landscape by levees, one had a completely different sense of alignment and of floating matters on it. That's the relative size of the barge which go down the Mississippi carrying products to America and from every other country in the world. And beds return us to Land's End. Here erosion and deposition, dredges and dikes, Pilot Town and its jetties opened a continent to navigation and trade. Flying over very recently, we could clearly see the disengaged mud of the Mississippi entering the Gulf of Mexico. Land here, instead of being extended, continues to diminish as the continental shelf is being weighed down by the load coming down of the Mississippi mud. And in the microcosm of the delta, one sees gathered the body of the nation. Or is it an inert system to manage? In this liquid territory, Pilot Town, not accessible by road, is the last habitable place of exchange. Here the ocean-faring vessels give over their command to the Mississippi pilots. Meanders, flows, banks, and beds become a way to travel the Mississippi landscape, as well as being the structure of this exhibition. I'd like to conclude with a particular journey down the Mississippi from Memphis to New Orleans on a towboat called Jim Ludwig in November of 1995. And Captain Riley Powell, which you see on the left, skillfully navigated us with a tow the size of 5 football fields. One might get some sense of that scale there. Through buoys and lights, fog, rain, and near collisions, unfolding horizons at 8 knots per hour. And here, 3 scheduled days extended into 6 unpredictable ones. I recall Henry David Thoreau's words in his essay Walking. The saunterer in the good sense is no more vagrant than the meandering river, which is all the while sedulously seeking the shortest course to the sea. Thank you.
Take some questions.
Certainly.
I think maybe if there are some questions for Anu, maybe I start by asking you about the project upstairs. And it does seem that somehow by taking this time, by spending this new ways of, in a sense, recording the sites, there's also maybe a different way of looking at the landscape than maybe some of the previous projects. I don't know. But I wonder whether you feel somehow this journey affected your approach towards your projects as a landscape architect, or if so, in what way do you think that that's happened?
I think it's an interesting question, because I think if you think of what I showed in the beginning and at the end, were really both travels of a kind, and one was, it wasn't that one wasn't looking for conclusions, but one was allowing the travel to motivate where we go. I think some of the projects you saw in the middle, which though I guess the sense about landscape was similar, but were essentially done in competition situations, where one very quickly has to put down a project and communicate it. And so I guess the travel was not as extended in those projects. But I think it was just another way of crystallizing the ideas into proposals, which I guess the difference, I would say, was the proposals were inherently thought through in a way that there was an opening left in them. That those projects were not done as projects which had to be designed in a particular way and finished. And so in terms of, like in Governor's Island, if you think of what was called the shifting ground there, or even, you know, a sort of a small device of the soil cars, was somewhere trying to find in these very controlled projects, how can we allow for an opening for other voices and other travels for of people to come within it. It's a struggle, but in many ways. I don't know if that addresses somewhat.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking that, for example, in terms of approach to landscape, there is certain aspects of traces of memory traces that could be one kind of approach, or the idea of use of devices as registrations and so on. When you get to the Mississippi project, somehow the scale becomes such an incredible part of this that there is genuine kind of bewilderment in terms of the variety of landscapes, and also the way in which you try to link those things then to certain phenomena like jazz or music or other kinds of events that take place on the site. So the landscape is not necessarily a landscape of meaning, of signification in that sense, but it actually changes in terms of how it's perceived, precisely because of, you know, these kinds of effects that you were talking about. So the role of meaning or signification in some way seems to change in terms of other conventions of landscape design. And that's my mind. It's very, very.
I think that was the
interesting.
aspiration.
Yeah,
And I think this whole notion of whether it's a river or a landscape, I think even talking to most landscape architects, we're very embedded in thinking of this as river, and just opening that question to debate transformed a lot for us in this travel. Yeah.
When you use the word of the term landscape design, how do you draw the line on percentage, you might say, as the waterfall is divided between the Mississippi and the other river, between landscape and design? There are some projects which presumably we call architecture, which are presumably 100% design. And then there are other places, still a few left on the planet, which are presumably 100% landscape. And somewhere between those 2 points, there is this thing, landscape design.
It's a puzzling question for me only because would you say that the Mississippi was one of those situations, or would it be one of the most constructed landscapes, on the other hand? Just the scale cannot be read only in architectonic terms, but it is as much designed as anything. But I think, like on any sites, I mean, I would actually not look at scale or that kind of extreme as a question. What the Mississippi does is that when we look back at even an intimate project, whether it's on a particular plot, I think some of those divergence and shifts are even apparent anywhere. But that really became a way to sort of go out of ourselves and find almost the biggest, largest aspect of this phenomena of how do you negotiate this tension. And I think what's happening in America is that either it's the engineers which you keep going controlling it, or we have the environmentalists who are the same, because for them not controlling is actually as much of a control. And I guess the question we are really interested in is how do you negotiate these territories tenaciously? Does that address that? I don't know whether you're asking in respect to the presentation on the projects here about...
Well, I didn't expect you to say, 35%. Or
I should have thought that question was directed more at the atmosphere of interpretation that your landscape design have. It's quite a contrast with the determination of the Army Corps of Engineers to tame the Mississippi, isn't it? To look back and say, completely on the other hand, it's a wonderful, powerful force, and the fact that it's untamable is its interest.
I think so.
But it leaves you, in terms of the previous question, it leaves you without necessarily having a determination to do anything at all.
Well, I mean, speaking from our point of view, and I would say for Dilip and me who've been engaged in making the drawings and traveling it, we found that this journey was really, was already a start of an intervention. I mean, by seeing something differently, you're already starting to open other things to question when design does become an issue. And in some ways we are at this point even going further and trying to find a way to work in the Delta area, which I think somehow we did have the most empathy for. I mean, even though we enjoyed the rest of the travels. And we've really been trying to address this question, can this seeing give us another strategy of thinking about what happens here? And it's a territory which is really depressed, taken over by Walmart parking lots. Even the agriculture, which is the main area, is being highly mechanized. And I think it is a challenge for us to think, how does Blue's meanders resurface as a way of seeing the landscape through design? So it's not concluded.
Right, but it means that it's sort of an oppositional activity to the structures that have gone before, doesn't it?
I guess it is, in some ways. Or it is working with them. I think we cannot start on landscapes like this with the assumption of that not being there. So I think the rich meander as well as the levee are both givens in this landscape. And what I think we're trying to do with each one of these maps upstairs is to bring forth tensions. So each map is really about a kind of a dialectic or a tension which exists. And I think the exciting part for us is now, as designers, if we were, or if we give ourselves the project to go further, how would this knowing affect what we might do there?
You mentioned about the Mississippi as the public enemy number one, which implies that actually although it's an enemy, but at least public, there's something common between the different kind of states who has nothing in common otherwise. And that means that the Mississippi can be a rhetorical device for federal government to somehow tie those states together. And in that sense,
Well, I think your first observation that it was that the Mississippi is something which brings all views together is an important one, because I think that is the tension here. And I don't really see it as man and nature, or if you translate, and that's the way the problem has always been translated, that it's between either man or nature, or it's between agencies. And there is one map upstairs in the site called Flows, in which we have a list of about 100 agencies which are involved, and each one wants something different. It's a labyrinth, and I think these kinds of landscapes will never be resolved like this. And it's almost a recognition that there may be a possibility that it cannot be controlled, which may give us a whole other way of thinking and inhabiting it. And so all the devices and all the debates have really been with the assumption that it can be controlled. And just opening that up, that uncertainty, I think will inherently bring will bring forth different attitudes. And so again, it's not man and nature for me at all. It's really about being able to inhabit, but how?
You said controlling. Once you say that somebody is controlling somebody else, by means of the river, the landscape.
That's one control. What I'm also saying is that the mandate given to the Army Corps, and it's really not the Army Corps per se, it's what the will of the nation was, because they do what is asked of them, was to control the river for navigation, to prevent floods. And it's already in the last decade, it's very clear that there is a whole shift. But the shift hasn't really looked at the difference between river and landscape. It's just that people are leaving the floodplains because it's costing too much money for insurance companies to keep paying back. So finally, after decades of thinking they could manage it, they are starting to move off. But the rhetoric hasn't changed in many ways. I mean, they've just given up and think they are better. When new devices come, people could move back in. And so it's the separation, and I think people, and it's not that the engineers don't know about the power of the river, of people who live there. It's just that when you're behind those levees and when you're constantly informed that things can be managed, you lose a sensibility of living tensely in these landscapes, which people have had.
Any questions from, I know there are a lot of students who are obviously working on some of these, or at least similar issues. Any questions from people who are doing that kind of work in the units? You all looking away, Demos? Anybody?
But catch us with me afterwards.
Yes. Okay. Well, maybe we go upstairs, and anybody who wants to ask more specific questions about the drawings, please join us there for a little while. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.